Hello and welcome to this special guest presentation today. My name is Lacey Sheldon, and I am a librarian at the McIntosh Memorial Library in Viroqua, Wisconsin. Thank you all for your attendance today and your interest in today's talk. Before I begin with introductions, I'd like to let the audience hear the guidelines for today's presentation. This event will be recorded for public use. If you do not wish to be seen on video, you may turn off your video camera now. Please mute your microphone during this event. However, we do want to hear from you during the general audience question and answer segment. Please hold your verbal comments and questions until that time. The agenda for this talk is as follows. I will introduce Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School, followed by an introduction for Dr. Soh-Hyun, Park Altino. Dr. Altino will begin her presentation in about 5 minutes. She will teach for about 30 minutes. Following her presentation, questions from Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School will be asked and answered, and then the students will be dismissed after their farewells to Dr. Altino. Following this, at about 1:35, we will open up for the question and answer segment for the general audience. After questions have been answered, we will conclude the program with closing remarks. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce the Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School. Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School serves over 130 children in early childhood through 8th grade. Founded 40 years ago in Viroqua, Wisconsin, Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School is an accredited, independent, nonprofit school focused on a holistic approach to learning that teaches the whole child, head, hands, and heart. The Waldorf education movement was founded 100 years ago and now has 1,100 schools and 2,000 kindergartens around the globe, and has become the largest independent school movement in the world. Miss Stephanie Pedretti, the school's music teacher, would like to welcome Dr. Altino to this presentation now.
Hello, I'm Stephanie Pedretti from Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School, and we are very grateful to Soh-Hyun for visiting our school virtually, and also very thankful to Lacey in the McIntosh Memorial Library for setting this up. It's like you are bringing us a field trip rather than us coming to you somewhere, so this is just a wonderful opportunity for our students this year. Also, I just wanted to also give a quick thanks to Vernon Communications for helping us with some equipment so we could do this at our school. We have 3 grades who are attending here, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And I was just going to very briefly mention that our school kind of has a special connection with Korea because for the past several years, we've hosted exchange students from Korea who are coming here to experience life in a small town in America and work on their English skills. They've been part of our classes for about a month or a month and a half, and they have done homestays with some of our school families. So I feel like this will be especially meaningful to our students to have this experience today. Thank you.
Maybe it's my turn now. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining me, and a special welcome and thanks to the Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School students, teachers, and families, as well as the community at McIntosh Memorial Library in Viroqua, Wisconsin for hosting this event. I'd like to begin by playing something for you, something short. you've noticed, what I just played for you is not Korean music. That was a movement from a work for solo violin that a German composer Johann Sebastian Bach wrote around 1720. I bet most of you have heard of him. Bach's music has always been an important part of my life, both as a violinist and violin teacher. I began playing the violin when I was a kindergartner. I have been a violinist for about 40 years and teaching at colleges for the past 20 years. In today's program, I would like to share with you a story about how I got to know a very different kind of music. At the end of the talk, there will be time for Q&A, as you've been told. I did receive several insightful questions from the Pleasant Ridge students this week, and I was surprised how profound those questions were. But if any of you would like to ask questions afterwards, there will be time for those as well. Again, please feel free to write down your questions in the chat box. When I was invited to give this talk, I heard about Pleasant Ridge School's exchange program for Korean students. Attending an American school and being part of an American family life is, for sure, one of the best ways to learn about growing up in the US. I'm sure that every one of those Korean students has enjoyed being part of your community. I had a similar experience as a high school student. I was born in Korea, Seoul, Korea, to a musical family. When I was in 10th grade, I came to Baltimore, Maryland, looking for a better educational opportunity for my violin studies. Because I came by myself without my parents, I lived with an American family. Those 2 years was a wonderful time for me to get to know the American culture and to learn English. My host family, whom I still stay in touch with after 30 years, helped me and took care of me in so many ways. I have strong memories from my first 2 years in America when it was almost impossible for me to pronounce some English words. Those included girl, film, world, invisible, Elmhurst, to name a few. I lived on Elmhurst Road, so that was important. My host family lived there, and they were all the words that I just mentioned. I needed to say them often, but they came out of my mouth as girl, film, world, Elmhurst, and invisible. I felt very embarrassed and discouraged at times because people did not seem to understand what I was saying, even though I was trying really hard. Why were those words so difficult for me to say? That's simply because the spoken Korean does not have the sound of English L, R, V, W. In fact, the sounds that F, G, J, Q, X, Z, and more make do not exist in the Korean spoken language either. Some of you might recall similar trouble that your Korean students at your school were having. Now, why did I not give up on saying these words better? That's only because I wanted to be able to talk with my friends and my teachers and my American host family. After all, language is all about communicating. Let's think a little bit more about languages. Learning a new language tends to open our minds up to become more interested in the culture and history of the people who speak that language. When we speak a language other than our native language and meet someone who speaks that language at, say, a school or work or in our neighborhood, we get excited and feel a connection with that person right away. So first, now I want to teach you two very useful Korean phrases. And I know you're muted, but I hope you will do this with me. Say, 배고파요. 배고파요 means I'm hungry. You say it again, 배고파요. Now say, 맛있어요. 맛있어요. That says it's delicious. If you go to Korea, you will need those two phrases. Let's try again, and I'll say them first and you repeat. This time, listen to how the syllables run with a particular rhythm. 배고파요. 맛있어요. If you were to say 배고파요 without the natural rhythm and inflection, the listener might not believe that you're truly hungry. In order to learn to speak words in a foreign language and be able to communicate our intentions clearly, we first need to listen very carefully to how the native speakers speak. When our ears begin to recognize and remember the details of how the native speakers pronounce the words, our progress will be faster. Those details include the tone of the voice, accented syllables, the inflections, which syllables run together and which ones stay separate, and even how the mouth moves when making those sounds. Our facial muscles, palate, and tongue all have to get used to those new movements before we can pronounce the foreign words well. What I've talked about so far is very much like my experience of learning to play traditional Korean music on the violin. We've all heard that music is a language. That statement has never rung truer in my life. Although I grew up in Korea, I never paid much attention to the traditional music. In fact, it's very common for the Koreans who live in Korea to know much more about the Western music than traditional Korean music. In my case, the first time I listened to traditional Korean music with open mind and open ears was just 2 years ago. Once I began listening to it though, I could not stop. I was deeply drawn to the unique nasal tone, earthy, dancing rhythms, sorrowful melodies, and the powerful emotions of joy and overcoming that the folk music communicated. Traditional Korean music sounded like nothing else I had ever heard before, and I wanted to learn to speak that language. Now, are you ready to listen to some Korean music? I have one disclaimer. I'll be sharing some video clips with you, and I want to apologize in advance that there may be some lagging. I'm going to work to resolve this for my next presentation, whenever that happens. So here I would like to share a song. Now, take a listen to the next clip to find out what was going on in the accompaniment part of that song. Try to tap your knees with your fingers as you listen. The melodic instrument you just heard is called the haegum, which is one of the two traditional bowed stringed instruments. It has two strings, as you can see, and it's held upright on the player's lap. The bow uses horsehair just like the violin bow or the cello bow. The drum you heard is the 장구, which is the Korean hourglass drum. 장구 plays the rhythmic patterns called 장단, which are central to all Korean folk music. There are many different types of 장단, and each of them gives a particular sense of speed, mood, and structure to the music. Now let's listen to the same song one more time. This time, pay more attention to the singer's melody. Her voice does so many interesting things: bending, folding, quick trembles, and wide vibrato on longer notes.
바람이 분다 바람이 불어 연평바다에 얼싸 돈바람 분다 얼싸 좋네 하 좋네 군밤이여 해라 생렬 밤이로구나 달도 밝다 달도 밝고 우주 강산에 얼싸 저 달이 밝고 얼싸 좋네 하 좋네 군밤이여 해라 생렬 밤이로구나.
Did you notice those details in her voice? For sure, this way of singing is very different from the singing we're used to hearing in Western music. There is one other Korean traditional bowed string instrument, and it's called the ajeng. The body of the ajeng is made of wood, and it has 8 to 10 silk strings and movable bridges. The bow again uses horsehair. Now, take a listen to the sound of ajeng. Isn't that an incredible sound? How would you describe the sound of ajeng? Rough? Soulful? Does it sound like it's choked? Crying? Does it remind you of any other musical instruments you've heard before? The ajeng sounds very much like the Korean pansori singer's voice and their vocal techniques. Pansori is a form of dramatic vocal music which emerged in the 18th century. In pansori, one singer sings and acts out all the characters in a work of narrative literature with the 장단 accompaniment, played by just one drum player, and each pansori work can last 3 to 8 hours long. Here's an example of pansori singing. The excerpt comes from 심청가, or the Song of Simcheong, based on the Korean folklore. In this dramatic scene, an older man is telling a tragic story about his life as a blind man and how he had lost his only daughter Simcheong, who volunteered to be a sacrifice in dire hopes that her love and devotion will bring her father's eyesight back.
처자 말을 들어놓으니 모든 돈에서 눈물이 뚝뚝뚝 떨어지며 이 소맹이 아래리라. 예. 없고 성병은 심학교요 을충년 정월달에 산후달로 상처고 어미 일은 딸 자식을 강부에 싸서 안고 이 집 저 집을 다니면서 동양조서로 떠매겨 개우 길려냈지 15세가 되었는데 효생이 출천하여 예비돈을 띄우려고 300석에 몸이 팔려 남경양산 선인 늙게가 임당수에 죽은 지가 53년이나 되었어. 돈도 뜨지 못하고 자식만 바라보는 놈을 살려 두었어. 당양 그 목숨을 끊어주어.
Wow, his crying voice and singing is so powerful and moving. If you think about how opera singers, musical theater singers, jazz, and pop singers sing, pansori singing is dramatically different from all of them. Did you notice the similarities between the sound of the ajeng, which we heard right before this, and the singer's voice? Did you also notice someone else shouting out short sounds or words in the video? That's the drummer who does that to agree with or to cheer on the singer, depending on the mood of the story. Violin is an instrument that has been around for 500 years, and it's loved for its most human voice-like qualities. After I fell in love with the Korean traditional music, I really wanted to make the unique sounds of the ajeng on my violin. Imitating the ajeng on the violin was, however, very difficult. In fact, it was the most difficult thing I had tried to learn as a violinist. And I felt lost, exactly like when I was trying to pronounce those English words right in my first couple of years in America. Now I'm going to stop the screen for this a little bit. I have been studying the music that ajeng plays called sanjo. Sanjo refers to a genre of traditional folk music that is played by one melodic instrument accompanied by the changu, the drum, changu player playing the jangdan. It's like pansori, which is performed by one singer and one drummer. A sanjo performance can be as short as 10 minutes long or as long as 40 to 50 minutes or even longer than that at times. There hasn't yet been a Western-trained violinist who has successfully learned to play the traditional sanjo on the violin. And that's because the sound of the violin and the way you play it has so little in common with the sound of the ajeng and how you play the ajeng. Just as the sounds of F, L, R, J, Q, W, V, and Z, and many other letters are difficult for Koreans to discern and say, it takes so much determination and listening and practicing for a Western-trained musician to be able to understand and speak the Korean musical language. Since I had no one to show me how to make these Korean sounds on the violin, I had to learn by watching sanjo videos played by an ajeng master. I listened and watched and practiced every day with the goal of eventually becoming fluent enough to collaborate and communicate with other traditional Korean musicians. Now I'd like to show you a fast tempo part from an ajeng sanjo performed by the ajeng master Kim Il-gu, whom you just heard singing in the pansori clip. Okay, let's see. changdan or the rhythmic pattern that is played by the changu in this section is called chajinmori. And chajinmori's speed and pacing gives that earthy and energetic character. One unit of the chajinmori rhythmic pattern is made up of 4 beats, and each of the 4 beats is divided into 3 smaller beats. Watch the demonstration of a changu player as he plays the chajinmori changdan. At the beginning of the demonstration, he counts out loud in Korean. Try tapping along on your knees as you watch.
하나 둘 셋 넷 둘 둘 셋 넷 하나 둘 셋 넷 둘 셋 둘 셋 하나 둘 셋 둘 셋
Redo the sharing and share the right one.
I was just told that I made a mistake. I'm going to try that again. Sorry about that. All right, let's see.
하나 둘 셋 넷 둘 둘 셋 넷 하나 둘 셋 넷 둘 셋 둘 셋 둘 셋 하나 둘 셋 둘 셋
Okay, some of that was easy to tap along with and some were pretty tricky, right? In traditional changdan, even though the rhythmic figures vary constantly, the length of time each unit of changdan takes remains the same for the entire movement or section. That was a lot to take in. Let me read that again. In traditional changdan, even though the rhythmic figures vary constantly, the length of time each unit of changdan takes remains the same for the entire movement or section of music. In all Korean folk music, the changu player improvises, making up rhythms that would complement the phrases that the melodic instruments play. Changdan is unique to Korean music and is the most important foundation to folk music. The feel of changdan contrasts greatly with how pulse is felt and communicated in Western music, which means that without a solid understanding of changdan, whatever I play would not really sound Korean. In addition to changdan, learning changdan, I've had to devise several unusual techniques on the violin in order to speak Korean. Now, I would like to play for you a passage from the Ajeng Sanjo I've been practicing, which is the one you just heard. I'll play a small section of it. Okay, so I played for you 3 phrases of Chajimori, maybe a little under tempo and without Changgu Changdan, which is a whole different experience. Now, did you notice some of the unusual things I was doing? For example, many of the pitches I play are not playable on the piano. They are microtonal. So for many months, the correct notes that I would hear in Ajeng Sanjo video sounded out of tune to my ears, and I could not discern what pitches to play. And that was a very difficult experience for me. Also, these pitches frequently bend and change during a given note, which makes it hard for me to remember what the notes were. So I'll show you a small example of that. And I play it really slowly. Many of those notes are not on the piano. Another thing I have to do in order to adapt my violin sound to the Korean sounds, I have to keep my violin's tone from freely spinning out and ringing. That means I have to move my bow much slower. I also have to decide which notes to vibrate and which notes to leave bare and raw, and they all have to be done exactly like that. I'll show you an example of that. Okay, and another thing I have to do very differently when I play the Korean music is every one of the busy and complex ornaments needs to be played with just the right kind of inflection and accents, but I have to do them very quietly, which is not what you normally have to do. Let's see, I'll show you another example here. And when I have lessons on this music, my teachers ask me if I counted how many vibrato I put. And if I vibrate one too many, they will recognize it and tell me that I did one too many. So this has to be very exactly done. Now, I'm going to show you a couple more slides. Let's see. Can you see this? Okay. Every day, I'm experimenting to discover better ways to make Korean sounds on the violin. My hope is that as my ability and experience of speaking the Korean language on my violin grows, I'll be able to serve as an interpreter or a translator to promote better understanding between the traditional Korean musicians and the Western trained musicians. And furthermore, I would love to help other musicians who desire to learn to talk in Korean on their Western instruments. Finally, I would like to share a part of the Sanjo video I made in Korea last August. And you'll hear the music that you'll recognize now. that's what I prepared to share with you. If you're interested in watching the 10-minute video of my Sanjo performance, you can look it up on YouTube using my last name Altino and the word Ajeng, Ajaeng. Now at this point, I would like to hand over the mic to Ms. Sheldon.
Mhm. Thank you, Dr. Altino, so much for that presentation. It is absolutely fascinating to be able to understand this pioneering work that you are doing. So incredibly interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Now we would like to ask the Pleasant Ridge Waldorf students if they have their questions for Dr. Altino.
Thank you, and thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to our 8th grade classroom with Ms. Amy Morse because I know some of the 8th graders have questions they're really interested in asking to Dr. Altino.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is really exciting. So some of my students have some questions. So first question.
Hi. My question is Korean music written differently than Western music?
Wow. Okay. Well, first, before I answer that question, I want to thank you for your questions because they're valuable to my research. I wouldn't know what you don't know if you don't tell me. And I have to say, PRWS students, they asked really profound questions that I actually had to go study to answer. I haven't had a lot of time to study, so I'm going to get better with my answers if you ask me next year. But I did find out, well, I knew, but I have found an example of how Korean music, traditional music is written, and I'm going to share with you a screen just so that you can see. This is the Korean notation system called Jeonggambo, and definitely looks different. This is made up of many boxes, as you can see. There are many boxes, and they indicate time. Each box is 1 unit of time, and the letters that are written in there are mostly Chinese characters, and they tell you the pitch. You can see on the right side of your screen, it even tells you when to breathe, when to rest, where the music ends, and where the measure lines are, and what's rhythmically tied, and the changdan, what the changu player is supposed to play with a circle and a line in the middle. This notation system is still used today by traditional musicians, and I think I'm going to have to learn to read this soon. But I hope this answers your question. Okay, how about another question?
Hi, my name is Emerson Hudnall, and my question is, how has researching traditional Korean music affected your mindset and playing and style of playing Western music?
Thank you. And that's a really important and good question. I find that I now pay a lot more attention to everything I do as a musician. I question many things I've done in my playing until now because I realized that I had not necessarily made those decisions about a lot of the things I was doing, but that I was playing them maybe mostly out of habit or convenience or maybe somebody else's decision. Studying the Korean music has definitely made me listen more intentionally, and listening is the most important job of any musicians. And I also want to add that studying the Korean music has also made me less afraid of trying other new and challenging things in life. And one example of that is how I homeschooled my 5th grader last semester, which I would have never thought to do before I did something so hard as playing the Korean traditional music. Okay. Another question?
Hello, my name is Gibson Wade, and my question is, what is the oldest known piece of traditional Korean music?
Now this question I actually had to call one of my mentors because I did not know this answer to this question. So the short answer is the oldest notated music that's still played these days that originated from Korea as opposed to China is court music from the mid 15th century, and it's written down, and it's not what we normally hear like arirang or other popular songs that we know. It's much longer before that, so mid 15th century, and that I'm going to study more for future. Okay, maybe another question.
Hi, my name is Reed, and my question is, who is your biggest influence besides your grandfather and your mentor?
Okay, that's also a really good question. Thank you. Besides my family, my parents, my husband, my siblings, and yeah, besides my family, there have been several teachers who have had big influence in my life. My violin teachers have not just been great violinists and teachers, but also very caring people as mentors in my life. I'm very lucky to have had many inspiring teachers in my life. Now, even as I'm a teacher myself, I continue to seek guidance and treasure my mentors' wisdom on my research, as well as how to do life in general. And I think we all need mentors, and I hope we will always look for our mentors, no matter how old we are. Okay, are there other questions that the students want to ask? Maybe not. Okay, I just want to say to the students, you have been a wonderful audience. This was a lot of new sounds and ideas to take in. When the pandemic is over and the Korean students can return to your school, maybe you'll surprise them with your knowledge of traditional Korean music. And thank you for your interest in Korean music and culture, and especially in the people of Korea. And at this point, I think the students are safe to go, and I'll stay on for questions from everyone else on the Zoom call. Thank you, students and teachers.
Before we all leave, I'll just break in on behalf of our school and just to thank you again, Dr. Altino. It was such an interesting presentation, and really, it gave us, I think, a lot of insight into Korean traditional music, and really fascinating at how you've translated it to the violin as well. So we really appreciate you spending the time with us this afternoon. It's possible that one of the classes might be listening in as the community asks you questions, but I wasn't quite sure about their class schedule. The rest of us will be heading on to our next period to finish the day. Thank you again. And thank you to Lacey in the library as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Ms. Pedretti, and thank you to the students and the teachers and the faculty at Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School. We do hope that they all have a very nice day. So now let's begin with the general audience question and answer portion of the program. I recommend that, and also if you are willing, would you please turn on your video camera, say your name and where in the world you are joining us from, ask your question, and then remute your microphone. So let us begin. Does anyone have a question for Dr. Altino at this time?
Okay, well, while we're waiting, I'm just reading the chat box. Do you think there are any other Western instruments that could adapt to Korean music? I think pretty much all winds and stringed instruments could adapt to Korean music. I think it's very difficult for keyboard instruments like piano to play the Korean music in a way that will sound real Korean, because piano is in a regular circumstance cannot play the microtonal pitches, and all those bending and changing pitches, that's just so essential to making Korean sound. But I think any other wind and stringed instruments, and certainly percussion, could learn to do the jangdan. Anybody else that'd like to ask questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it hard to translate the Korean music, how it's written, to English music, how that's written?
That's a good question. So when I'm learning this music, the music I have, and I'll show you what my music looks like. But traditionally, this music that I'm playing is learned by ear and not with any music. And all the masters have learned without written music. And now, more recently, people are writing it down. And I don't know if you can see kind of, well, I'm going to show you the paper copy that probably has less glare. So my music looks like this. It's mostly a skeleton of the notes that I'm changing to fit to violin. And since no other violinist has done this before, there isn't written music that has indications that violinists would need to look at to play. So I'm in the process of changing all those things that I see in this version that's for ajeng to the music that violinists can look at and play. Thank you for that question. Anyone else?
There has been a question entered into the chat box that I'd like to read off. The question is, has your work been well received in Korea?
You know, I really wondered about the same when I was trying this, starting out this project, and also because I'm Korean and because I had never paid attention to it. Emotionally, it was very complicated, but thankfully, the Korean traditional musicians have received this really well. They're excited for the possibility that they hear that Western instruments can play the Korean music quite close to what it's supposed to sound like. And I've also received responses from Western trained musicians that live in Korea as they are seeing the possibility and becoming interested in perhaps doing that on their own. And so far, I've only received really positive and joyful responses. And I will share with you that I got to meet the master Kim Il-gu myself last summer, and he is about 80 years old, and he had never heard the sanjo played on the violin or cello or viola or any other Western instruments. So he had lived as a musician for 70 years, and it was a brand new experience for him, and he was really excited for how the music could become more globalized by being played on Western instruments.
Wow, well, that is so incredible, Dr. Altino. That's really amazing. There is another question that came in that I could read off for you.
Yeah.
The question is do you have future plans to perform in America and South Korea or both?
I think if there was no pandemic right now, I would have gone there this winter. But yes, I would definitely like to go to Korea and learn more. First of all, I have to learn a lot more from the traditional Korean musicians, and also I would like to learn from the master Kim Il-gu. And also, he would like to play this music together, and that'll be the first time that that's ever done. So when the mandatory quarantine and all the complicated process calms down a bit, I would definitely like to go there to do that. And then perhaps some of the traditional musicians could come here, or maybe the ones that already live in the States could play with me. So I think the possibilities are many, and I'm very excited thinking about them.
Yes, that's very exciting. I think we'd all like an invite to that event when we can do that. There is another question I could read for you. The question is, will you attempt to teach traditional Korean music to students who are not advanced in their technique and playing ability?
I think the most important thing is that they're interested and that they're willing. It's just like when you try to say those words in foreign language and you probably won't get it the first time or the second or the 10th time. And even if you got it the first day after several tries, the next day you try to say that, it's going to come out not so good. And I think if people are willing to be patient to acquire that language, I would love to help people learn how to do that. We can try with something very small, just like you start out with alphabets. You don't start out reading a novel, so we'll have to approach it that way. But once you kind of get a hang of it, it does become easier. I wouldn't say it's easy for me right now at all, but it does become easier. So I would love to.
That was very motivating and encouraging to hear.
Thank you. I see another question from my former neighbor, and I would like to answer that question. This summer, I believe you were translating some of your grandfather's work. Does your presentation overlap or reflect that work? Oh, that's a really, really good question. I began this work because my composer grandfather, who lived from 1922 to 1993, was really devoted to traditional Korean music, but he composed mainly for Western instruments. And when I finally got old enough or mature enough to play his music, I realized right away that I didn't know that language enough to play it. So my original intent was to learn just enough to be able to play my grandfather's music without feeling like I'm faking it. But it got me into this whole other world. And once I went to Korea and got into looking into my grandfather's work more, I realized that he actually played a lot of the different Korean instruments, as well as he studied it seriously for a period of time and interacted with the traditional musicians. It just was not something that people understood why he was doing or what he was doing. So it was not really known, but I found out that was what he was really passionate about. So I did also record my grandfather's work. It's on YouTube as well, and you can listen to that. I feel that I have to know the traditional language better to be able to come up with printed music of my grandfather's piece. It's also called sanjo, in a way that really translates what he might have thought or what he would like us to know. So that's coming, but once I get better at my language skill. Those are great questions.
Yes, absolutely. We continue to learn more and more from you. Thank you. We could give another pause. Oh, yep. A question came in about this particular recording. Will it be available to share? I can answer that question, and the recording of Dr. Altino's presentation will be available on this library's YouTube channel within a few days. That is Macintosh Memorial Library Viroqua YouTube channel. I also wanted to say that if anyone would like to read more about Dr. Altino's bio, they can find that on this library's website, macintoshmemoriallibrary.org, or also on the University of Wisconsin-Madison's website as well. And then Dr. Altino, will you remind us of your YouTube channel and where we can find more information of your performances?
I was not in any type of social media at all, but I had to kind of find out if people liked this kind of new work. So right now I have just one channel under my last name that has my grandfather's pieces and this recording. I imagine I'll add to that, but yeah, it's just begun. So much
Very
more.
nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. I do have one question for you as well.
Yes.
What are your aspirations for this? You've been telling us very clearly about how you've been working with a master of the traditional Korean music, and that must be incredibly rewarding, and also very rewarding to be teaching new generations of this and bringing awareness to traditional Korean music. Beyond that, where would you like, where do your aspirations guide you?
Yeah. So well, I knew that I never paid attention to traditional Korean music myself, but once I started looking deeply into this, I realized even my family members or people that I went to school with, most of them had no idea what the traditional Korean music was. And I feel a kind of a heartache thinking about how Korean people don't know their own traditional music. In fact, the word that means music in Korean language, it automatically refers to Western music, and Korean music has to be called national music. So it has gone through a rough time in history. In the past 100 years, I think it's actually getting a little bit better, and school students, our children, are learning about Korean traditional music now, but it's still something that people don't know what to think. So my ultimate dream is to see the two musical worlds in Korea and beyond Korea come together and be able to communicate and to be able to understand each other and appreciate. That is really at the end of this study. Maybe it will take me a lifetime, but I think that's a worthwhile cause.
Yes, absolutely. And best wishes for all of that to happen for you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining this afternoon. This was my first time, and I'm so encouraged by all of your interest and your attendance. And thank you, Lacey, for setting this up. She worked so hard for hours and days, and probably much longer than that, to make this happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Altino, for your presentation today. On behalf of McIntosh Memorial Library, thank you so much. Yeah, I'd also like to mention that Dr. Altino's presentation was made possible in part by the University of Madison's Center of East Asian Studies. So we'd like to give our thanks to our associates there, Ms. Lori Dennis and Mr. David Fields. Thank you to the Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School faculty, staff, and their students. And this guest presentation has been an event for the library's acknowledgement of January East Asian Heritage Month, which is the first month of the library's year-long all-ages humanities program entitled Creating Community Beyond Biases, Library Resources. So please remember that anyone who is participating in that year-long program, that they can record their attendance to this guest presentation today as well. More information about that can be found on the library's website. If anyone has any further questions, they could direct, for Dr. Altino, they can direct those questions to me at my email address, which is the letter L period Sheldon at WRLS web.org.
Would you mind putting your email on the chat box?
I am happy to.
Great. Okay, thank you for making time in your busy day, everyone.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for your attendance today. Much appreciated.